Welcome to the Respiratory System Lecture 13 in the list, so on we go. The respiratory system is literally the system for gas exchange. We're going to be running through from the openings to the lungs, right? The whole purpose is to bring oxygen in and essentially carbon dioxide out. It consists of the nose and nasal cavity, the pharynx, the epiglottis, the larynx, and the trachea, the bronchi and bronchioles, the lungs, and the alveoli. Alright, there we go. Not terrible. And we start at the nose. So, in the nose, in the nasal cavity, air is warmed as it passes through the capillary-rich, the nasal cavity is lined by capillary-rich tissue. And so there's a lot of blood and the air is warmed as it passes in there. So that, since you're breathing it into your core, where your heart is, you don't have extremely cold air enter there. Right? So it's warmed. At the same time, your nasal cavity is lined with mucus and also hairs. So all them nostril hairs, right, they catch stuff, catch debris. All that mucus, it catches debris. And in addition to catching debris, the mucus moistens the air passing through the nasal cavity. At the top of the nasal cavity, you have the smell receptors. So they're going to be up in the top layer of the nasal cavity, which is why you tend to want to do a good inhale when you want to really smell something, so you can get as much air as possible up to the top layers of the nasal cavity. There's a bunch of little nerves right here connecting the nasal cavity to those smell receptors. And so the majority of the air that passes through goes past these conchae here and on into the pharynx. So you have to get a nice good sniff to really smell something with a subtle scent, because you need as much of it as possible up there at the top. Sinuses are cavities in the bones of the skull that connect to the nasal cavity and allow for the circulation of mucus. There are multiple different sinuses. Some are paired, and they're just in different bones. The frontal sinus here, also here, right? The frontal sinuses are paired, and they are in the frontal bone, right? There's a sinus in a bone called the sphenoid bone, right here, and amazingly enough, it's the sphenoid sinus, unpaired. Then we have some sinuses in a bone called the ethmoid, and so these are the ethmoid sinuses. I don't know, the word ethmoid always makes me feel like I'm talking while I have a cold. Anyway, the ethmoid sinuses are paired in along there. These are the ones you're always feeling when you're, you're putting pressure to try and reach your ethmoid sinuses. They're further in, though. And then lastly, we have the maxillary sinuses, a little pair of sinuses right along there. And these are hollow cavities with mucus and air in them. And mucus circulates, and various things happen in the sinuses. So they connect up to the nasal cavity. They are cavities filled with moisture, or mucus, and they circulate mucus through the nasal cavity. They help to moisturize the air, and they help to filter the air with all that mucus catching debris. So, saying it so many times, it's probably specifically worth mentioning that mucus is one of the most important parts of the nasal cavity. right? Its whole thing is that it traps, in addition to moistening air, it can trap particles and pathogens. And mucus is well patrolled by macrophages, those immune cells we just recently learned about. Aha! So, the macrophages patrol the mucus pretty effectively and attack pathogens that happen to be in the debris. So, it increases production in response to a number of different situations. So mucus production can be increased or decreased based on exposure to particles and pathogens, right? If you happen to have some inflammation causing some swelling of the tissue lining your sinuses, and at the same time you're sick, causing an increase in mucus production, you're going to have increased volume of fluid in your sinuses and decreased sinus volume because the tissue surrounding it is inflamed and it's tender anyway, so suddenly you have pain and pressure in your sinuses. Sucks. And that's sinusitis. Alright, on to the pharynx. In the digestive system, we said the pharynx was the throat, the location of swallowing. Now, the pharynx is actually divided up into sort of regions, right? So when we look at the pharynx and say the word pharynx, we're actually referring to several different parts. The part connecting to the nasal cavity that is up above the hard palate is called the nasopharynx. So it's the nasopharynx that connects up to the nasal cavity. Then, connecting up directly behind the oral cavity is the oropharynx. And then at the bottom is the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx interfaces with both the esophagus and the trachea. Whoa, not the right button. So it interfaces with both the esophagus, sort of behind the trachea, which is this larger rigid tube for breathing. So the pharynx is a common cavity. The throat is a big common cavity used in both respiration and digestion. Our barrier to the respiratory system is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little piece of elastic cartilage that is or elastic connective tissue that is, cartilage, hey, good me, is extremely elastic, and it serves an extremely important function in that you don't breathe what you eat. So, basically, as food passes beyond the tongue into the oral pharynx, right here we can see, the food causes the epiglottis, and swallowing causes the epiglottis to bend downward and block off the trachea so that food is guided into the esophagus where it's, supposed to go. So it blocks anything you're swallowing from entering the trachea. And it directs what you're swallowing into the esophagus. Then we come upon, so if we're not food, if we're air, we get past the epiglottis, and the first thing we encounter is the larynx, also known as the voice box. It's at the top of the trachea. Here we go. Circled right now. So this is my little epiglottis. And basically, it's what allows me to talk to you. The larynx is a cartilaginous structure. Right? It is often called the voice box. In men, it tends to be larger and longer and protrude, so we call it the Adam's apple. Anyway, it is a flexible structure, which is good because, you know, you want to be able to turn your neck and look up and look down without snapping the thing that makes speech possible. And inside the larynx are the vocal cords, right? The vocal cords are really fascinating. These are elastic connective tissue structures, and they vibrate to produce sound, right? All you need for sound is vibration. And so we can see this nice little side view, a cutaway here of how the elastic connective tissue sort of pushes together. When air is forced through, when you force air up past the voice box, the vibration, right, the frequency, how often these things slap together, how far apart they are, how, you know, long, or like how long they are versus how short they are. All of this determines a number of different parts of your voice. But the whole thing is that it allows you to produce sound, right? Your oral cavity, your nasal cavity, your tongue, your lips, all of those will shape the sound so that it comes out in specific ways that we want it to, such as words. But the sound itself is produced, right? You can shorten and tighten the vocal cords so that you produce higher pitch, and you can make the vocal cords longer and looser to make a lower pitch. So short, stretched, higher pitch, long, loose, lower pitch. And then, as I said, it's not just your vocal cords that are responsible for your sounds. It resonates in your pharynx, your nasal cavity, your sinuses, and it resonates in your mouth. And then how you've got your cheeks positioned and your nose, how much air is coming out of your nose, what your lips are doing, what your tongue is doing, right? All of that shapes it. So if you're French, you don't breathe out of your nose when you talk, so you get a little bit like that, and you're like, bonjour, je m'appelle Jonathan, je voudrais un autobus, je suis en autobus, je voudrais manger un autobus. Right? So, anyway, kind of fun. And I love this little film if it still works. Yes. Again, Inception, YouTube within YouTube. Oh. But this is a great endoscope, which is uncomfortable. They thread it up through the nose, past the nasal cavity, down through the pharynx, and get it up slightly past, not past, but slightly at an angle to the epiglottis, so you can see inside the larynx and see the vocal cords. There are 6 different muscles controlling the vocal cords, so it's pretty amazing. I like this one right here.
Nasal drainage. This is the hardest part. I know it's going into your throat. That's the only part that's a little painful. Okay, relax. Relax with me. I know.
All right. Here is, we can see the epiglottis as this large flap here, and then beneath it we can see these little tissue posts where some muscles are attached to help move the voice box, and then right in there we can see the actual vocal folds, the tissue.
I know. It's the only part that hurts.
Now, these vibrate at specific frequencies, so they turn on a light that also vibrates in order that vibrates, strobes at a frequency, so you can see the vibration. So he's humming now.
A little higher. That phonation, inhalation. Start low and go high for me. How about one fluid note, low to high?
I love this thing.
Do anything you want. Anything you want on tape.
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's eye, and it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way.
Okay, I don't follow.
I don't know, I just really enjoyed that video. Let's see if I can get out of this. Ooh. Ha! Okay, so we've got a nice little endoscopic anatomy so far because we can see
an anatomical tutorial produced by founder ear, nose, and throat consultants of Warrenton, Virginia.
a little
Endoscopy
bit.
is ready to commence.
It's a little small.
Here we have a view of the anterior nasal cavity.
This is the nasal cavity, the septum between the left and right nostril.
The endoscope is being
You can
passed
see
through
this
the nasal
delightful
cavity to both
mucus.
aspects.
Then we're approaching
Note the soft
the
palate.
nasopharynx. There's the eustachian tubes leading to the ears.
Up and down to insert this tasks. Baby bottle.
Baby bottle.
Back of the nasopharynx.
The endoscope will now be passed
Then
through
you
the belly
go
where
down.
we will get our first glimpse of the voice box.
And there's the epiglottis and the voice box. I don't know, that one really showed the nasal cavity quite well in the pharynx. So anyway, on to your breathing tube, right? The trachea, sometimes called your windpipe, right? If you're not a biologist, at least. The trachea is a structure composed of connective tissue and a series of strong cartilaginous rings. Right? These cartilaginous rings help maintain the trachea's structure. It can widen slightly, but it doesn't constrict an awful lot. Those cartilaginous rings keep it open. So that's good. You want to breathe. So this is a semi-rigid structure. Again, it can move because they're rings instead of a single rigid tube. So there's bending allowed, but it's still rigid enough to keep its shape. It is one long tube. It's pretty sweet. It is lined with cilia and mucus, right? In case you don't remember the good old mucus elevator. So, those little ciliated cells have all that mucus covering them, and then random bits of particles or debris can be trapped, and the cilia move the mucus up out of the trachea into the pharynx, where you can swallow excess mucus. You can hawk it up a little bit. Some of that mucus may end up in your nasal cavity as boogers. Anyway, it's all taken up out. The trachea is nearly sterile because of all these defenses. After the trachea, we have our first branch, right? We have a branch into two separate tubes, one going into the right lung and one going into the left lung. So this will be our left lung. This will be the right lung. And these are the bronchi. So these are the big branches coming off, are the bronchi. Singular is bronchus. Similar in structure to the trachea, but smaller. The bronchi branch out outside the lungs. The first division occurs outside of the lungs, and then it's the bronchi that actually enter the lungs. Once inside the lungs, the bronchi then branch out into a series of smaller and smaller branches, each one having its own smaller and smaller cartilaginous rings, until you reach the smallest branches, right? The bronchioles. Bronchioles are the smallest branches off of the bronchus. The bronchi, however you want to do it. Anyway, bronchioles are worth noting because they do not have any cartilage surrounding them. So they're so small that there's no cartilaginous rings surrounding them. It's the bronchioles that interface directly with what's going to take up the largest volume of the lung. So here you can see the Body Worlds people have subjected they've filled the bronchi with a, I think latex probably or something, and then dissolved away the flesh and preserved the tree. So this is my bronchus. Here's the other one, so the bronchi, and then we have branches, and then littler branches, and littler branches, and littler branches until you get to the tiniest little branches. And it's unlikely that any bronchiole branches are even still preserved on this. They're so small. But the bronchioles are teeny tiny. So this is your lungs. This is what everyone thinks of when they hear lungs. This was removed from someone, from an unfortunate, I believe, sheep, maybe? Anyway, so you can see the larynx. Mammals all have somewhat similar larynxes. Human larynxes are much more complicated, obviously, because we can, talk. Then we have the trachea. There's the big old heart. They laid it over this such that we can't see the bronchi in there entering. And then we have all our beautiful soft tissue lungs, right? These are elastic tissue sacs. That's pretty much all they are. And they are filled with the bronchi, the bronchioles, tons of blood vessels, and the air sacs, or alveoli. Right? You have millions, 10 to the 6th, there's millions of these little air sacs in there. Millions of alveoli. And each alveoli are clusters of smaller little grape-like sacs where actual oxygen exchange occurs. These are air intake machines, baby! So let's look at an alveolus. So the alveoli, plural, alveolus, singular. Right? So the alveolus is this whole grape structure. Like, it looks like a bunch of grapes. Right? Entering into it is a little duct. So you'll have your little bitty bronchiole, and then you'll have little alveolar ducts coming off of that bronchiole. Right? So here's my bronchiole. And then I have my alveolar ducts coming off my bronchiole, even smaller than the bronchiole, and they connect directly to my grapey structures. These have an extremely thin cell wall, 1 cell thick. This is because we want the exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood to go as easily as possible. So diffusing across the 1 cell thick vessel wall of a capillary, then through the 1 cell thick wall of an alveoli, is relatively easy. So it makes gas exchange as efficient as possible, right? Every single little grape-like sac in an alveolus has a capillary cluster around it, right? So here's my little sacs here. This is a really nice image because it has the capillary beds attached to it, right? So you can see every single one is associated with a capillary bed. And these little tiny alveolar sacs are where the little tiny alveolus grape sacs are where gas exchange actually occurs. So gas exchange is pretty simple. It's just diffusion. So if you'll recall, deoxygenated blood from the body comes into the right atrium of the heart, right? And from the right atrium, it goes into the right ventricle of the heart. And then from the right ventricle of the heart, it goes into the pulmonary arteries. And the pulmonary arteries are what take blood that is deoxygenated over to the lungs. So, is in blue we have our blood from the pulmonary arteries coming in, and then they arrive at the little sacs, right? And it's kind of sort of just physics and position, right? When we first arrive, we have our deoxygenated blood, and it's high in carbon dioxide, the byproduct of all that respiration to make ATPs. So it's got a higher concentration of CO2 in the blood than in the air that's in the lungs, and so CO2, as we arrive, exits. Just simple rules of diffusion, because there's only a 2-cell barrier, the 1-cell the 1-cell thick wall of the alveoli and the 1-cell thick wall of the capillary. It's very easy for the CO2 to diffuse out. And then, as we get past there, right, we also have the fact that this is lower in oxygen than the air, so O2 diffuses in. It's literally just diffusion. Very simple. The lungs themselves are an extremely simple structure, right? There's not even really all that much to breathing. So when we look at breathing itself, all it is changing the volume in the lungs. That's all it is, right? The official anatomical term for breathing is ventilation. There are 2 components to breathing, right? You probably know them. Right? Inhaling, which the proper term is inspiration, and exhaling, the proper term being expiration. So inspiration and expiration. And they both have some hallmark components. So, inspiration. In inspiration, your diaphragm contracts, right? When it contracts, it lowers down into your chest cavity. So it pushes down. At the same time, unconsciously, your rib cage sort of moves up a little, right? And it sort of opens up as your ribs spread out. So, basically, you increase the space in your chest cavity. And when you increase the space in your chest cavity, it enlarges the lungs. So the lungs enlarge. So it enlarges the chest cavity and the lungs enlarge. And why this allows you to breathe in, like there's no structure pushing the air down into your lungs, right? You may think that's a pretty, that's a heavy-duty muscle-induced thing, but all that's happening is you're enlarging the chest cavity. Why everything else happens after that is something along the lines of this, where P is pressure. This is gas pressure formula, but we are going to pretty much ignore it except for our little friend, volume. Right? So it doesn't matter what this is. If you have 10 and your volume is 10, then your pressure is 1. But then if you, the volume is the volume of your container, in this case our lungs, right? So if your pressure formula kicks out 10 here and your volume is 10 here, your pressure is 1. But then if you increase the volume, the pressure goes down, right? Well, guess what? Air, or really gases, go from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. Kind of like our diffusion rules. Gases or air move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. When you enlarged your chest cavity, which enlarged your lungs, you increased the volume here and thus decreased the pressure, allowing the air outside to now be at a higher pressure than the air inside. So air just goes in. That's all there is to that, baby. Your tongue can help a little bit with suction, but at its basics, it's kind of like diffusion in that you're going from high to low, but it's literally just pressure. The air pressure inside is now lower than outside. So amazingly enough, expiration, right, and you can tell this, right, that it's not some muscular pumping, because when you do this, right, at a certain point, I kept my mouth open and I kept my lungs in the same position, but air stopped going in because I filled my lungs up with enough air that now the pressure was the same. And once the pressure was the same, inhaling stops. It's all pressure. So if you need to get rid of air, increase pressure in the container. So the diaphragm relaxes, and as the diaphragm relaxes, it moves upward in the chest cavity. This raises the diaphragm into the chest cavity, right? The rib cage unconsciously moves a little down, right, and a little bit in, and the ribs, little muscles in the ribs, pull them closer together so that your chest cavity gets smaller. It decreases the volume of your chest cavity, and that squeezes your lungs, and it literally decreases the volume of your lungs. So if our original pressure formula was this, and we squeeze them lungs down, right? Here was our outside pressure, and, right, it's 1.0, and now we've decreased the volume and it's 1.5. Well, guess what? We're going to go from high to low in your small lungs to the outside air. The air pressure outside is lower. So the air pressure inside, the air pressure is higher inside versus the outside air. So air moves from high to low and exits your lungs. Like literally, that's breathing in and breathing out, is changing the volume of your lungs so that pressure does the work for you. Right? If I exhale, at a certain point, no more air is coming out because, again, there's a certain point where pressure equalizes. So I get rid of enough air that the pressure inside is the same, and it just doesn't keep coming out. It's all a pressure game. Kind of cool. Okay, gas exchange. I literally just mentioned that. But basically, in the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, right, we have the interface, and blood coming from the heart has a large amount of carbon dioxide from all that ATP production. Remember, C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O, and a byproduct is the ATPs that you need to be alive, right? Well, that 6 CO2 is sent to the blood, right? The body cells exchange their CO2 with the blood, and boom. So when it gets to the heart, the blood is rich in carbon dioxide. And so when it gets to the lungs, there's more carbon dioxide in the blood than there is in the outside air. So carbon dioxide diffuses out. At the same time, because, the reactant side of making ATPs requires oxygen, the body used up oxygen. So coming from the heart, we're also low on oxygen, and so there's more oxygen in the outside air than the blood. Oxygen diffuses into the blood. Now, the lungs are extremely simple, just operating off of some basic laws of physics. There's not like hormones altering the permeability of the lungs to carbon dioxide, reuptake of this, reabsorption of that, secreting this enzyme. It's just pressure and diffusion, right? Because the oxygen in the alveoli is high and the oxygen in the capillaries is low, the oxygen goes from the alveoli to the capillaries. Because the CO2 in the capillaries is high and the concentration of CO2 in the air in the alveoli is low, it goes from the capillaries to the alveoli. This is not rocket surgery, and it's also very cool that this functions so effectively while being so damn simple. Alright, now let's talk about how we control respiration, right? Which is basically what you're in control of is what's going on with your diaphragm. So, deep breaths, fast breaths, right? That's what you can control. And this control basically occurs at the brainstem. So, at the brainstem, you have basically the best hypothesis for it right now is that the brainstem takes sensory information regarding the amount of carbon dioxide in the lungs. Right? So when the carbon dioxide in the lungs increases to a certain point, indicating that a whole lot of blood has gone through and fed carbon dioxide into your lungs, it hits something in the brainstem and stimulates taking a breath. Right? So your basic breathing rate the current best hypothesis. They're actually competing hypotheses for what causes you to unconsciously breathe, right? What function in the brain is happening to unconsciously breathe. But it seems that the best hypothesis I saw recently was that basically it's carbon dioxide in the lungs, right? You don't want tons of oxygen in your lungs because that might kick it over to the point where you have to voluntarily breathe. You have to have carbon dioxide in the lungs in order to actually trigger breathing. I don't know. Kind of funny. You'd think oxygen. Anyway, obviously, you also have conscious control over breathing, right? You know, if you fall unconscious, you're still going to breathe. But when we are conscious, we can breathe when we choose how we choose, right? Oh, I'm such a yawn. Right? So you have voluntary control over the way you breathe as well. So I have a friend who decided to use his voluntary control over breathing once to hold his breath until he passed out, at which point his voluntary control over breathing stopped and his brainstem took over and he, didn't die because he breathed. Kind of fun. On to pathologies. So first up is carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide poisoning is very dangerous. It's highly lethal. Right? The reason carbon monoxide poisoning is highly lethal is because carbon monoxide is highly efficient and effective at binding to hemoglobin. Carbon monoxide, CO, is extremely effective at binding to hemoglobin, right? That iron on your hemoglobin, all over in those heme groups, right? Carbon monoxide forms a very tight bond to that iron. Right? So carbon monoxide forms a very tight bond. And it very quickly can overwhelm red blood cells. Basically, it's a concentration game. Once you get to a certain concentration of carbon monoxide in the air, it outcompetes enough oxygen that you don't have enough oxygen binding to red blood cells and you suffocate. Right? Hypoxia. Hypo, low, oxia, oxygen. Hypoxia is low O2, dangerously low O2. So when you are hypoxic, you are not getting enough oxygen. Carbon monoxide can induce hypoxia at the right concentrations pretty fast. You can die from high carbon monoxide concentrations in the air very quickly. So, very dangerous. Continuing forward with our pathologies. Laryngitis. Itis is inflammation. Right? So, the hallmark of inflammation is redness, tenderness and pain, and of course, swelling. Now, the problem with laryngitis, when you look at some healthy vocal cords right here, when you have inflammation in the larynx, and you have swelling of all the tissues surrounding the vocal folds, you kind of highly limit your ability to manipulate your vocal cords. And this is why severe laryngitis can cause you to lose your voice, because the tissue is just too swollen to effectively move those folds enough to really create sound. Kind of horrifying when it happens. So, inflammation of the larynx, and the larynx is all the tissue surrounding the vocal folds. So when that happens, you reduce vocal fold mobility. Bronchitis, again, our friend inflammation. So when you have inflammation of the bronchi or bronchioles, right? So here's your bronchus, and here it is normally. Inflammation causes that swelling and reduces the diameter of the airway. Not good for you. So, inflammation of the bronchus reduces the diameter of the airway, can lead to a little bit of shortness of breath. Chronic bronchitis is a very common side effect of smoking. So, smoking is a great way to just completely jack up your respiratory system. Speaking of great ways to completely jack up your respiratory system, there's emphysema. So emphysema is actually a disease of the alveoli. Right? So if you have those little alveoli, like this, right, they're sort of have all these nice little membranes separating them. And the whole point is that it creates this really efficient airflow. When air comes in, it travels around that little sac, follows the contour. So breathing in and out allows pretty efficient air movement through the alveoli. Right? But with emphysema, something goes terribly wrong. The buildup of particulates, especially tar, in the alveoli. So the alveoli fills with tar. And the tar causes irritation of those membranes. And what can happen is those membranes end up breaking down. Right? And so where once it was a nice, easy circulation, now there's no nice membranous guide to make airflow easy. So it reduces efficiency of breathing. Emphysema reduces your efficiency of breathing. It basically reduces oxygen exchange. Right? If it can't go through in that nice easy pattern, and you can't get air pulled into each one of those sacs in each breath, then you have reduced the amount of air you can pass through these over time, and you're reducing oxygen exchange. So when you have emphysema and you've irritated those alveoli from filling them up with tar, the membranes break down and you reduce your oxygen exchange capabilities, so it's harder to breathe, and emphysema is irreversible. The damage to the alveoli is irreversible. This is one of those diseases that's cumulative, right? The longer you smoke, the more damage you suffer. So the good news is, as soon as you stop taking tar into your body, it gets cycled out relatively quickly, and as long as you're not taking more tar in, you're not damaging any more alveoli. So the sooner you quit smoking, the more alveoli you save. So you can't save the ones you done killed with your tar, but you can save the ones who haven't filled up yet. So quit your smoking. 80% of emphysema cases are due to smoking. Right? Anything that can irritate or fill up your alveoli can cause emphysema, can cause this damage. But when it's 80% of cases due to smoking, we tend to sort of shorthand associate emphysema with smoking, which I do. Continuing forward. Cancer! Did someone say smoking? 90% of lung cancer cases are due to smoking. So, let's take a look at why. Because you irritate the crap out of the cells in your lungs. And a carcinogen damages cells. And the more damage you have to cells or their genome, the more you have to repair it, the more options you have to screw up the repairs, and the more options you have, or more chances you have to get tumors. So when smoking makes your lungs look like this, you know that you are damaging cells left, right, center, all over the place. And so you're damaging your cells and your DNA, and you're increasing your chances of cancer, right? So don't smoke. All right, and then on to asthma. So asthma asthma is often associated with allergies. So you can have an allergic reaction to something like pollen. And basically, asthma causes a smooth muscle spasm, right? Your bronchi actually have a layer of smooth muscle in them that can help adjust how wide they are. So you can dilate or widen the pathway, or you can constrict it. And it's that smooth muscle layer that allows that. So in allergy, you have a smooth in asthma, you have a smooth muscle spasm that causes constriction. Right? So the smooth muscle spasm constricts the bronchi. At the same time, so we're restricting and closing up the bronchi. At the same time, we increase mucus production. And it basically can cause your airway, right, to seem as though it can drastically constrict the airway, right, to the point where you feel like you can't breathe, or maybe are even in danger of hypoxia. So visible signs, one of them is wheezing, right? If you are wheezing when you are breathing, that's because what's happened is the smooth muscle has decreased, constricted the bronchus, and the increased mucus means that you're having to pull air through mucus past your larynx, and it's causing a wheezing sound. So difficulty breathing and wheezing are signs that are useful in diagnosis of asthma. Symptoms, the felt stuff, is generally like, panic and stress. You feel like you can't breathe, or that you're not getting enough air, and then your brain says, hey, maybe you're going to suffocate. And if young kids can have a real hard time understanding that asthma may not kill them, but it might, right? A strong asthma attack can seal off a bronchus. Strong enough asthma attacks can seal a bronchus off. Right? So, luckily, there are treatments out there. People with asthma have inhalers. Right? That inhaler releases a steroid that relaxes the smooth muscle and reduces any kind of inflammation response. So, it's not inflammation. It is smooth muscle. So that's what's fascinating. Smooth muscle and upregulated mucus. So, the inhalants are steroids that act to relax the smooth muscle spasm and reduce any inflammation from the irritation. Okay. Respiratory pathology. Final respiratory pathology. Final slide, if I recall correctly. Pneumonia. Pneumonia is when your alveoli fill with fluid, right? So maybe it's lymphatic fluid, or pus, right? Lymphatic fluid, a byproduct of an infection in the lymphatic system. Maybe your vessels, or it could be pus, right? Either way, you get an accumulation of fluid in the alveoli, and obviously fluid is not good for gas exchange, so anywhere alveoli are filling with fluid, you are not exchanging gases. So it can be very dangerous. The most common cause of pneumonia are infections with some kind of pathogen.